The moment it all changed happened in a room paneled with dark, imposing mahogany, the air smelling of old paper and older money. I watched my sister Veronica, a woman whose entire identity was built on unshakable confidence, as her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble on the polished table. Across from her, our grandfather's elderly lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, a man of quiet iron and unwavering loyalty, looked up over his spectacles. His voice was calm, but every word landed with the finality of a gavel. "The clause is unequivocal," he stated, his gaze steady. "Any action taken with the intent to sell the property results in immediate forfeiture of all hereditary claims." Veronica's own high-priced lawyer, a man who had entered the room with the swagger of a guaranteed win, was now staring, dumbfounded, at a single paragraph in the open file. All the color had drained from his face. My sister's gaze finally snapped to me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that was quickly being consumed by a venomous rage. In that instant, I wasn't her mousy little sister anymore. I wasn't the family footnote they all treated me as. I was the architect of her ruin. It had all started 2 weeks earlier, at a family dinner that felt more like a wake for circling vultures. The air was thick with the cloying scent of false sympathy and barely concealed greed. The first official gathering since Grandpa's funeral. Veronica, a high-flying real estate developer who saw the world as a collection of assets to be liquidated, unveiled a glossy brochure with a triumphant flourish. An artist's rendering of a sprawling golf resort gleamed under the dining room chandelier. "I've already got a developer lined up," she announced, tapping a manicured nail on the page. "Blackwood Ranch will be the premier luxury destination in the state." My father, a man who worshipped the success he never achieved himself, beamed and raised a glass to her brilliant business acumen. I felt a familiar coldness creep into my stomach as I spoke up, my voice barely above a whisper. "Grandpa never wanted it sold. It was his legacy." Veronica let out a short, pitying laugh that cut deeper than any shout ever could. "Oh, Lena, your endless sentimentality. This isn't about memories, it's about assets." She leaned forward then, her smile a predatory slash designed to put me back in my place. What would a government bookkeeper possibly know about managing a multi-million-dollar property? My parents just nodded, their faces a mask of condescending agreement. That one question. It wasn't just an insult about my job. I saw 10 years of money is tight while she got a new car for graduation. I saw the busted laptop I had to replace myself. It was the dismissal of my entire life. The sum of 1,000 other cuts. This was a declaration of war. She called me a bookkeeper, thinking it was the ultimate insult. She had no idea that a bookkeeper for the Department of Justice doesn't just count beans. We follow the paper trail to bury people like her. To understand the reckoning that was coming, you have to understand the two lives I was living. To understand the disconnect, to truly grasp how my family could see a bookkeeper when a federal agent was standing right in front of them. You have to look at the world they built for me. It was a carefully constructed narrative, polished and perfected over 2 decades, and its star was never, ever me. My role was simple: be the reliable, stable, and utterly boring background character. The set, dressing for my sister's spectacular life. Last Christmas was a perfect example of this. Our living room was warm and bright, filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon. But the real heat came from the spotlight fixed on my sister Veronica, the family's golden child, who wore her charisma like a shield. She was holding court on the velvet armchair, a glass of champagne in one hand, regaling everyone with the story of her latest 6-figure commission from flipping a condo in the city. She spoke of escrow and market trends with a slick confidence that my parents found absolutely intoxicating. They hung on her every word, their faces glowing with pride. My father, a man who worshipped the financial success he'd never managed to achieve himself, eventually stood up to make a toast. He raised his glass, not to the season or to family, but directly to her. "To Veronica," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. "The family provider. The one who knows how the real world works. The family provider." I just smiled and raised my glass with everyone else. Inside, though, I felt that old, familiar hollowness. It was the same feeling I got when they paid for her MBA without a second thought, while I worked 3 jobs to get through my own master's program. It was the echo of 100 conversations where her ambitions were treated as investments, and mine were treated as hobbies. Later that evening, my mother, Carol, a woman who believed maintaining a pleasant facade was more important than acknowledging uncomfortable truths, found me in the kitchen. She gave me one of her signature pats on the arm, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but always felt dismissive. "So, how is your little job going, dear?" she asked. I took a breath and decided to try, just one more time, to make them see. I told her I'd just closed a major case, that my work had led to the recovery of the entire life savings of over 200 seniors who had been swindled in an elaborate estate fraud scheme. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of genuine interest. But then it was gone, replaced by that familiar, placid smile. "Oh, that's nice, Lena," she said, her tone laced with a faint pity. "But it sounds so grim. All that sad paperwork. You really need to get out more, have some fun like Veronica." And there it was, the final verdict. My life's work, the thing that gave me purpose and meaning, reduced to sad paperwork. It was in moments like these that their nickname for me felt the most real. Lena, the Ledger. That's who I was to them, the boring, stable, but ultimately irrelevant accountant in the grand, exciting saga of the family. Now, let me show you the other world. My world. It doesn't have the warm glow of a Christmas tree or the sound of popping champagne corks. It exists in secure, soundproofed federal briefing rooms, places where the air is cold and the truth is measured in verifiable data points. Here, I am not Lena the Ledger. Here, my official title is Forensic Accountant, Asset Forfeiture Division. I don't do sad paperwork. I systematically dismantle international criminal enterprises by tracking stolen funds through a labyrinth of offshore shell corporations, digital currencies, and ghost transactions. I hunt financial predators. Just a week before that Christmas dinner, I was standing in one of those rooms. The file on the massive screen in front of me was codenamed Operation Heirloom, the very case I had tried to explain to my mother. My boss, the assistant U.S. attorney, a man who did not waste words and did not suffer fools, was pointing to a complex flowchart on the screen that looked like a spider's web. "The entire case was stalled for 6 months, he said to the room, which was filled with serious high-ranking agents from 3 different federal agencies. "We couldn't find the ultimate beneficial owner. They were buried too deep." He then tapped a single box in the center of the web, a box with my initials next to it. Lena's analysis found the UBO hiding behind 3 Panamanian LLCs and a Cayman trust. She didn't just find a discrepancy, she pierced the corporate veil with a goddamn spreadsheet. He turned and looked at me, not with the condescending pity of my parents, but with a silent, profound respect that was worth more than any toast. "Because of her," he finished, his voice low and firm. "We're not just prosecuting, we're seizing everything." The room was quiet. There was no applause, no cheering, just the quiet, powerful acknowledgement of a difficult job done with lethal competence. This was the duality I lived in. At home, I was the daughter who handled government forms. In that room, I was the agent who dismantled empires. The whiplash between those 2 realities was exhausting. It all came to a head in a phone call with my father, just a few days after that disastrous dinner where Veronica declared her intentions for the ranch. I tried to explain the legal complexities of Grandpa's estate, the nuances of the trust he had set up. He cut me off before I could even finish my second sentence. His voice was laced with that familiar, weary impatience. "Lena, stop. Veronica has lawyers for this, top-dollar people. She knows how the real world works." He sighed, as if I were a child he had to constantly manage. "You just stick to your government forms, okay? Let the professionals handle it." And he hung up. Stick to my government forms. The same forms that had just put a dozen criminals behind bars and recovered millions of dollars for their victims. The condescension was so deep, so ingrained, He couldn't even hear how absurd he sounded. For 20 years, I'd let them define me. I let Lena, the ledger, be my identity at home. But they had made a critical error. They brought their fight into my world, a world of contracts, clauses, and consequences. And in my world, the fine print is everything. After my father hung up on me, a strange and profound calm washed over me. The hurt was still there, a low, familiar ache, but it was different now. It was no longer a wound, it was fuel. There were no tearful phone calls to my mother, no screaming matches with Veronica. I didn't plead or argue or try to make them understand. The time for that was over. Instead, I drove to my office in the dead of night, the city lights a blur outside my window. Inside the sterile quiet, I sat at my terminal, opened a new encrypted file on my secure drive, and labeled it simply Blackwood. My goal was no longer to win an argument. It was to enforce a legal document. In my mind, Veronica's greed and my parents' willful blindness had become a case file, and I was going to approach it with the same cold, methodical precision I used to dismantle criminal enterprises. There would be no emotion, only evidence. I began by pulling every record Grandpa had ever given me copies of: financial statements, property deeds, and years of personal correspondence. To my family, they were just dusty papers in a box. To me, they were exhibits. I spent the next week building a timeline, cross-referencing his letters that mentioned preserving the legacy with obscure state-level agricultural and land trust statutes. I wasn't just looking for a sentence in a will. I was establishing a clear and legally indisputable pattern of intent. This was what I was trained to do: find the story hidden in the paper trail. In a way, I was performing a forensic audit on my own grandfather's final wishes, and the picture that emerged was crystal clear. He had seen this coming. The next step was to schedule a formal consultation with Mr. Abernathy, my grandfather's lawyer. When I walked into his office, I wasn't a grieving granddaughter seeking comfort. I was a prepared professional coming to a strategy session. I placed a thick, neatly bound folder on his polished desk. Inside was my analysis, complete with tabs marking 3 specific letters from Grandpa that explicitly mentioned a failsafe to protect the ranch from what he called Veronica's ambition. Mr. Abernathy, a man of immense integrity, read through my summary in silence. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. He looked up at me, his eyes sharp and clear. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," he said. He confirmed my suspicion. "Your grandfather called it the stewardship mandate. He knew you were the only one who would have the patience to find it, and the intelligence to understand it." In that moment, I felt more seen by that kind old man than I had by my own parents in my entire life. We decided then and there to invoke the clause and schedule a formal reading of the complete will. We were setting a trap, using the law as bait. The official notice for the final will reading was sent. Veronica RSVP'd with a condescending text, "Get ready to sign the papers, sis." She thought she was walking into a coronation. She had no idea she was walking into a deposition. The day of the reckoning arrived. We gathered in Mr. Abernathy's formal conference room, a place that felt more like a courtroom than an office. The air was heavy and still, thick with the smell of old leather-bound books and even older money. It was a room built for delivering final judgments. My parents were there, flanking my sister Veronica like silent, devoted royal guards. Their presence was meant to be a show of force, a united front to intimidate me into compliance. Opposite them, Veronica and her shark of a lawyer sat with their backs straight, exuding a smug, unshakable confidence. They looked at me, sitting alone on my side of the vast mahogany table, with a mixture of pity and annoyance as if I were a procedural hurdle to be cleared before the real business of collecting their prize could begin. They thought the meeting was a rubber stamp. I remained silent, my posture calm, my hands resting lightly on the thick, bound document in front of me. It was over 100 pages thick, filled with data, projections, and legal frameworks. It was my weapon, and I had spent weeks sharpening it to a razor's edge. I felt no fear, no anxiety, only a cold, crystalline focus. The game was already over. This was merely the part where I revealed the final score. Mr. Abernathy began, his voice a dry monotone as he read through the standard. Bequests of the will. Minor assets, personal effects, charitable donations. It was a deliberate, methodical performance designed to lull the opposition into a state of bored complacency. Veronica's lawyer was already checking his watch. My sister was idly scrolling through her phone. They weren't even listening. Then, Mr. Abernathy paused. He carefully took off his everyday glasses and put on a pair of reading glasses. The silence in the room stretching with the small, deliberate action. He cleared his throat. "And now," he said, his voice taking on a new weight, "we come to the codicil concerning the primary asset, the Blackwood Ranch." Suddenly, the phone was down. The lawyer sat up straighter. My family leaned forward. Mr. Abernathy looked down at the document and read, each word landing with precision. "The ranch is not to be considered a liquid asset, but a living legacy. As such, it cannot be sold, subdivided, or leveraged for commercial development by any heir." Veronica's lawyer immediately scoffed, letting out a sharp, arrogant laugh. "That's a textbook restriction on alienation, completely unenforceable," he declared to the room, waving a dismissive hand. "We'll have that struck down in probate court by Tuesday." Mr. Abernathy didn't even look at him. He simply continued reading, his voice unwavering. "Control of the ranch, and all its revenue shall pass not by simple inheritance, but by usufruct." He paused, letting the obscure legal term hang in the air. "To the sole heir who presents a formal, viable, and legally sound plan for its long-term preservation and ecological sustainability." He finally looked up from the page, his gaze sweeping over all of us. The will required any such plan to be submitted for consideration prior to this reading. Did anyone prepare such a plan? This was the moment. Veronica smirked, the picture of triumph. "Of course," she said, sliding her glossy single-page resort brochure across the table with a flick of her wrist. "Here's the plan. A billion-dollar development that will finally make that land worth something." Mr. Abernathy glanced at it for a fraction of a second before his eyes met mine. I took a deep breath. Then, slowly and deliberately, I pushed my own document forward. The heavy binder slid across the polished wood with a solid, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room. I spoke for the very first time, my voice even and steady. I tapped the cover of my proposal. "This is a 120-page conservation and business plan, complete with certified soil reports, state water rights, charters, 5-year agricultural revenue projections, and a fully executed partnership agreement with the State Land Conservancy." I looked directly at Veronica's lawyer, whose smug expression was beginning to falter. "My plan, compliant with Section 4C of the will, and notarized last month, establishes the ranch as a profitable, self-sustaining conservation trust. It fulfills the stewardship mandate." I then gestured toward her flimsy brochure. "Hers is a sales proposal, which, under the terms of the will, legally constitutes an attempt to sell, and triggers the forfeiture clause." Absolute silence. It was as if all the air had been sucked of the room. Veronica's face, once flushed with victory, was now a ghastly pale white. Her lawyer, speechless, began frantically flipping through his copy of the will, his jaw slack with disbelief. My father's head swiveled back and forth between me and Veronica, his mind caught in a catastrophic failure to compute what was happening. He was looking at his daughter, the quiet government bookkeeper, but the words he had just heard, the strategy, the authority, the utter dominance, did not belong to the person he thought he knew. But my eyes were on Veronica. She just stared at me, her mask of superiority completely shattered. For the first time in her life, she was seeing me clearly, not as her sentimental little sister, but as the person who had been in the corner of the room the entire time, quietly holding all the cards. My sister had spent her life collecting assets. I had spent my life studying them. In the end, she learned the harshest lesson in business. Never, ever underestimate the person who reads the fine print. The explosion of silence that followed my final statement was shattered by the sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor. Veronica was on her feet, her face a contorted mask of pure rage. Her lawyer, flustered and defeated, scrambled after her, muttering empty threats about lawsuits and challenging the will in probate court. They stormed out of the office, a whirlwind of impotent fury. My parents followed them, but not with the same anger. They looked utterly lost, like two people who had just watched the sun rise in the west. Their entire world, with its clearly defined roles and predictable outcomes, had been irrevocably broken. Their golden child had fallen, and the quiet one, the footnote, had been the cause. They didn't even look at me as they left. The heavy office door clicked shut, leaving Mr. Abernathy and me in a profound, ringing silence. He let out a long, slow breath and turned to me, his old eyes crinkling at the corners. He extended a hand across the vast, empty table. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud, Lena," he said, his voice filled with a warmth that felt more genuine than any praise I had ever received from my own father. "He didn't just leave you a ranch, he left you a test, and you passed it perfectly." I shook his hand, its grip firm and steady. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's shattered expectations, I didn't feel abandoned. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen. I felt validated. 1 year later, the air here smells of sun-baked earth, wild grass, and pine. The only sounds are the whisper of the wind through the valley and the distant lowing of cattle. I'm sitting on the wide porch of my grandfather's house, but it's my house now. A new, tasteful wooden sign stands at the head of the driveway. It reads, "Blackwood Ranch and Conservancy, EST, 1948. The land is vibrant, more alive than it has been in years. The fields are green, the fences are mended, and the old barn has a new roof. This is what a living legacy looks like. I'm not in a secure federal office anymore, but my work hasn't really changed. Instead of a legal file, the open book on my lap is a ledger for the ranch's operations. I'm still a forensic accountant, but my skills are now being used for cultivation instead of prosecution. I track rainfall patterns instead of illicit transactions. I project crop yields instead of asset forfeitures. I used my expertise to create a business model that allowed us to partner with the local agricultural university and establish an educational program for their students. I didn't just save the ranch from developers. I made it better. I made it profitable, sustainable, and a cornerstone of the community. My true family is here now. It's not one I was born into, but one I have built. It's made up of people like Maria, our head ecologist, a brilliant woman, with dirt under her fingernails and a fierce love for the land. It's made up of old ranch hands like Gus, who knew my grandfather and now looks at me with a quiet, earned respect. It's the bright, eager agricultural students who spend their summers here, their minds full of new ideas about sustainable farming. Our dinner conversations aren't about commissions or assets. We talk about soil health, water rights, and the legacy we are building for the future. It's a family founded on a shared purpose, not a dysfunctional obligation. I was sitting on the porch just last week, watching the sunset paint the hills. In shades of orange and purple, a deep sense of peace settled in my bones. And then, my phone buzzed. A harsh intrusion from a world I had left behind. It was a text from my mother. I felt a familiar, tired knot tighten in my stomach before I even read the words. Veronica had to file for bankruptcy, it read. Her developer deal fell through, and she was overleveraged. Your father is so worried. You have all that land. Could you please help her? I read the message twice. The old Lena would have felt a surge of guilt, of responsibility. The old Lena would have seen her father's worry as her problem to solve. The old Lena would have seen her sister's failure as her duty to repair. But I looked up from the glowing screen of the phone, at the vast, peaceful, thriving landscape that was my responsibility and my sanctuary. I saw the legacy I was protecting, the peace I had fought so hard to win. This was my world now. Their chaos has no place here. My peace was no longer negotiable. I held my finger over the screen for a long moment, and then I simply archived the message without replying, took a deep breath of the clean evening air, and went back to watching the sun go down. My sister thought legacy was something you could liquidate. I learned it's something you cultivate, one right decision at a time. If you've ever had to fight for what's rightfully yours against people who only see value in dollar signs, share your story below. Here, we know that true worth can't always be counted.